Welcome back to the world of Eichert, where we learn how to think
like the College Board.
Today we're covering topic 8.7, Global Resistance to Establish Power Structures After 1900. Here's the required content. This first part is kind of a review, and then an overview of the other sections. Conflict dominated much of the 20th century. 2 world wars and mass atrocities in Unit 7, proxy wars and armed decolonization struggles in Unit 8. And this next section is about nonviolent resistance. The section after that is about how militaries and militarized states increased conflict. The last section is about how some movements used violence to achieve political aims. Let's start with some examples of non-violent resistance. Mohandas Gandhi. We first saw him in 7.5 as a leader in the Indian National Congress and India's independence movement against Britain in the years after World War I. Gandhi's resistance movement followed the philosophy of satyagraha.
Mr. Eichert, do we need to know Gandhi's philosophy and beliefs?
Well, since 8.7 has a cultural thematic focus, I think we should pay attention to belief systems. Satyagraha had several principles, beginning with ahimsa, non-violence, in thoughts, words, and deeds. Ahimsa was an ancient principle that is a core part of many Indian religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. So you're saying ancient belief systems continued to be culturally relevant into the 20th century and beyond. Excellent observation. Satyagraha also included Swadeshi, or self-sufficiency. An early example of Satyagraha in practice was the non-cooperation movement that began in 1919, when people boycotted imported British goods, especially manufactured textiles. Instead, they made their own clothing using hand looms, as they had done in pre-industrial times. This was important for cutting off the economic aspect of British imperialism, but it was also important symbolically, as an example of the principle of Swadeshi, that Indians could and should rely on themselves and not the British colonizers. Another example of Satyagraha was the Salt March of 1930, where Gandhi and his followers marched 240 miles to Dandi on the coast, protesting Britain's salt tax and making their own salt. This epic march got widespread media attention and was admired by many in the international community. It took many decades and several more Satyagrahas, including the Quit India movement during World War II. But finally, in 1947, the British agreed to decolonize India, an example of negotiated independence from 8.5. Next is Martin Luther King Jr. in the U.S., who you probably already know for his nonviolent resistance to racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans. Dr. King was influenced by Gandhi's Satyagraha movements, and as a Christian reverend, he was also deeply influenced by the words of Jesus Christ, who encouraged people to turn the other cheek, nonviolence. Dr. King had 6 principles of nonviolent resistance, believing this would win friendship and understanding. The goal was not to defeat people perpetuating injustice, who King saw as also being victims, but to defeat injustice itself, and to choose love instead of hate. There was the Montgomery bus boycott, resisting racial segregation of buses in Alabama. King and many others refused to use the buses, arranging their own forms of transportation, including carpools and Black-owned taxis.
So like Gandhi's Satyagrahas, they used boycotts and self-reliance.
Excellent comparison. The boycott was successful and led to the Supreme Court declaring bus segregation to be unconstitutional. Dr. King's March on Washington in 1963 was a major reason for the successful passing of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, ending the discriminatory Jim Crow laws as well as racist voting restrictions. Now Nelson Mandela in South Africa. The white minority controlled the government, and in 1948 established apartheid, a racist policy including laws that controlled the movement of non-white people and restricted their rights to own land or businesses and to access quality education. This was resisted by the Black majority, including members of the African National Congress, such as Nelson Mandela, who largely used nonviolent means like protests and boycotts to resist apartheid. As the apartheid regime's suppression of this resistance became increasingly brutal, Mandela and others in the ANC advocated more violent guerrilla tactics. But while in prison for 27 years, Mandela became more influenced by the ideas of both Gandhi and Dr. King, and reaffirmed his commitment to nonviolence. When apartheid finally ended in 1994, Mandela was elected president, and he created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which sought peaceful resolution instead of violent revenge. So South Africa under Mandela's leadership is also an example of a state that resolved conflicts through nonviolent means. Now for something completely the opposite. Militaries and militarized states that responded to conflict in ways that intensified conflict. First, Chile under Augusto Pinochet, a military commander who came to power in a military coup in 1973. Pinochet's suppression of dissent included the murder of over 2,000 political prisoners, as well as the torture and beatings of many thousands more. Pinochet's regime also suppressed labor strikes and protests by using tear gas and live ammunition. Rather than reducing political conflict, Pinochet's brutality led to even more radicalization of those resisting him, including the revolutionary left movement, which utilized armed guerrilla tactics that added further violence. Now Idi Amin of Uganda, an even more notoriously brutal commander who also seized power in a coup in the 1970s. The military, under Amin's direction, targeted specific ethnic groups and regions, particularly those loyal to the previous regime, like the Acholi and Langi. He expelled all Asians, mostly of Indian and Pakistani origin, but in the end there was no ethnic group that was not targeted, even Amin's own ethnic group, the Kakwa, because of his growing paranoia about potential opposition to his rule. There were mass killings and disappearances, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 100 to 500,000 people. Amin also relied heavily on the military to maintain control, leading to a highly militarized state where military solutions were often applied to political problems, creating an environment of fear and violence which permeated all levels of society. The last part of 8.7 is about how some movements used violence against civilians in an effort to achieve political aims. Let's focus on Al-Qaeda, a militant Sunni jihadist group founded by Osama bin Laden, whose main aim is to unite the Muslim world under a single caliphate, which would be done in 5 steps. 1. Stage a mass attack on American civilians, provoking the US to invade a Muslim country. 2. Incite local resistance in that Muslim country against the occupying Americans. 3. Expand the conflict to neighboring regions. 4. Establish decentralized Al-Qaeda franchises that could be run independently throughout the Sunni Muslim world. And 5. The US economy would collapse by 2020, causing an end to the globalized economy and setting the stage for a worldwide jihad. Al-Qaeda is known for sponsoring acts of mass murder, such as the infamous attack on the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11, 2001, that killed over 3,000 people, and many other acts of terror around the world. And there were many more examples of movements that used violence around the world to achieve political means. That's all for today. Next time, we'll talk about the end of the Cold War.